Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mind Matters, the podcast dedicated to exploring the intricacies of the human mind. Today, we're embarking on a journey into what I call the mind's catalog of conduct. We're going to uncover some of the deeply ingrained patterns that define how individuals experience life, themselves, and others. The diagnostic manual that psychiatrists use, the DSM-5, is like a comprehensive catalog of these mental architectures. And while some names might sound familiar, like narcissistic or antisocial, the spectrum of personality disorders is far broader and more nuanced than popular culture often leads us to believe. Today, we're going to explore 8 of these mental blueprints, some of which operate largely in the shadows of public awareness. We'll demystify terms, separate reality from fiction, and understand that behind every diagnostic label, there's a human way of existing, often accompanied by profound suffering, both for the individual and for those around them.
1. Covert narcissistic personality disorder. When we hear narcissist, the image that often comes to mind is clear: someone grandiose, loud, demanding to be the center of attention, boasting about their achievements, and openly disparaging others. This is the classic overt or grandiose narcissist. But there's a much more subtle and, for many, more insidious manifestation of this disorder: the covert narcissist. The covert narcissist shares the same core as the grandiose one: a deep need for admiration, a lack of empathy, and a sense of entitlement. However, their strategy for obtaining what they need is completely opposite. Instead of saying, "I'm the best," the covert narcissist says, "No one suffers like me." Their grandiosity is expressed through victimhood. This person won't brag about their successes, they will lament their failures, subtly implying that they were too good, too sensitive, or too intelligent for a cruel world that doesn't understand them. They use self-pity as a weapon. While the overt narcissist attacks you, the covert one disarms you by making you feel guilty. They are masters of passive aggression. If you forget something, they won't get angry. They'll tell you with a sigh, "Don't worry about it." They seek validation not through applause, but through solace. They present themselves as vulnerable, sensitive, and deeply wounded, attracting empathetic people who want to save them. The problem is that, at its core, the dynamic is the same. The relationship revolves entirely around them. Their needs eclipse everything else. And while they may seem shy or introverted, their sense of entitlement is absolute. They believe they deserve special treatment precisely because they have suffered so much. This form of narcissism is difficult to detect because it masquerades as humility or sadness, but it is just as self-centered and exhausting for those who fall into its orbit.
2. Histrionic personality disorder.
If the narcissist wants admiration and the covert narcissist wants pity, the histrionic individual wants attention. Any kind of attention, good or bad, positive or negative. It all counts as long as the spotlight is on them. Histrionic personality disorder, or HPD, is defined by excessive emotionality and a constant craving to be the center of everything. A person with HPD feels profoundly uncomfortable and even invisible if they are not the focus of the room. To achieve this, their behavior is often theatrical, dramatic, and exaggerated.
Their emotions seem superficial and shift rapidly. They might be crying inconsolably one minute and laughing heartily the next, but one often gets the sense that it's a performance for an audience. Their physical appearance is often a key tool. They might dress provocatively or flamboyantly, using their physical attractiveness to capture gazes. This isn't necessarily about sexual seduction, but about attention capture. They speak in an impressionistic way, with grand gestures and strong opinions, but if you ask them to elaborate, they often lack details or substance. "That movie was the most incredible, transformative experience of my life," they might say, but couldn't explain why. They are highly suggestible, quickly adopting the opinions and styles of those they admire or from whom they desire approval. They perceive relationships as much more intimate than they actually are, calling someone they barely know their best friend. The core of HPD is a terrifying emptiness, a sense of identity that depends entirely on external validation. If no one is looking at them, it's as if they cease to exist. This leads them to impulsive and often inappropriate behaviors in a desperate effort to generate a reaction, any reaction that confirms they are alive and present in the world. It's an exhausting life, lived on an imaginary stage where the show must never end. 3. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder. Here's where confusion often reigns. When people hear obsessive-compulsive, they immediately think of OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, repeatedly washing hands, checking locks 10 times, having intrusive thoughts. But obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, or OCPD, is something entirely different. OCD is an anxiety disorder. People with OCD perform compulsions or rituals to alleviate the anxiety caused by obsessions, unwanted thoughts. They know their rituals are irrational and often wish they didn't have them. It's ego-dystonic. It's in conflict with their sense of self. OCPD, on the other hand, is a personality disorder. It's egocentric. The person sees nothing wrong with their behavior. In fact, they believe their way of doing things is the only correct way. OCPD is defined by a paralyzing preoccupation with order, perfectionism, rules, lists, and mental and interpersonal control. This isn't just someone who's organized or neat. This is the person who cannot start a project until the plan is absolutely perfect, and as a result, often never starts. It's the boss who micromanages every detail of their employees' work to the point where nothing gets delivered on time. It's the person who cannot delegate a simple task like grocery shopping because they are convinced no one else will buy the correct vegetables. For someone with OCPD, flexibility is the enemy. Rules are not guides, they are unbreakable laws. Their perfectionism interferes with task completion. They might spend hours aligning objects in their office instead of doing the work they have pending. In relationships, they are rigid, moralistic, and often stingy, viewing money as something to be hoarded and controlled. Their emotional life is repressed. Logic and control take precedence over feelings and spontaneity. While OCD is an anxiety hell, OCPD is a prison of rigidity. It's perfectionism taken to such a destructive extreme that life itself, with its inherent messiness, becomes impossible to live.
4. Schizoid personality disorder. In a world obsessed with social connection, likes, and parties, schizoid personality disorder, or SPD,
is perhaps the most perplexing. SPD is characterized by a pervasive pattern of detachment from social relationships and a very restricted range of emotional expression in interpersonal settings. We're not talking about shyness. A shy person wants to connect but fears rejection. We're not talking about introversion. An introvert enjoys social interaction in small doses, but recharges in solitude. The person with SPD simply has no interest. The schizoid individual seems indifferent to opportunities to develop close relationships. They neither desire nor enjoy being part of a family, a friend group, or a community. They almost always choose solitary activities. If they have the option to go to a party or stay home reading a technical manual, they will choose the manual without hesitation. They show an almost total disinterest in having sexual experiences with another person. And perhaps most striking, they seem indifferent to the praise or criticism of others. A promotion at work or an insult on the street might elicit exactly the same reaction: none. Their internal emotional life is minimal, or at least that's what they project. They are described as cold, distant, with a flat affect. They rarely experience strong emotions like anger or joy. They live in an inner world that can be rich in fantasy and abstraction, but which they rarely share with anyone. This is not isolation caused by social anxiety, as in avoidant personality disorder. It's an isolation that stems from a fundamental lack of desire for connection. For them, human relationships are complicated, messy, and unnecessary. They prefer the predictable clarity of objects, ideas, or their own thoughts. It's the existence of the hermit, not by philosophy, but by personality configuration. 5. Psychopathy. Although psychopathy is not a formal diagnosis in the DSM-5, it is included under the umbrella of antisocial personality disorder. However, it is a crucial psychological construct that deserves its own place. Psychopathy is perhaps the most popularized and at the same time the most misunderstood disorder. It is sometimes confused with psychosis, which is a loss of contact with reality. But a psychopath is firmly anchored in reality. Simply, their reality does not include the emotions that drive the rest of us. The core of psychopathy is a profound and devastating lack of empathy and remorse. To understand it better, let's look at the dark triad of personality, which includes psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Well, the narcissist needs admiration, and the Machiavellian strategically manipulates to achieve a long-term goal. The psychopath is different. Their behavior is characterized by superficial charm, egocentric grandiosity, a need for stimulation, they get bored easily, pathological lying, and cunning manipulation. But the key is the lack of emotional response. They don't pretend not to feel guilt. They literally don't feel it. Another person's suffering is to them like watching a chair fall, a neutral event, or, in the worst cases, entertaining. This allows them to use people as objects for their own benefit or amusement without the slightest moral hesitation. Not all psychopaths are serial killers. In fact, most are not. Many are successful or pro-social psychopaths. ruthless executives, manipulative lawyers, or charming politicians who climb the social ladder precisely because they are not burdened by empathy, guilt, or fear. They are intrasocial predators. They see the world as a game and other people as pawns. They can mimic emotions, crying at a funeral, laughing at a party, but it's all performance, a mask to blend in. Behind it, there is a cold, calculating void. The spectrum and normality. Where do we draw the line? After hearing these descriptions, it's almost inevitable that an uncomfortable question arises. Wait, do I know someone like that? Or am I like that? We can all be a little narcissistic when we get a promotion. We can all be a little histrionic when we tell a good story. We can all be a little obsessive when we clean the house before guests arrive. So, where is the line? This is the most important question in personality psychology. The answer boils down to 3 words: rigidity, chronicity, and dysfunction. First, rigidity. For most people, personality is adaptable. You're serious in a work meeting, relaxed with friends, and vulnerable with your partner. You have traits, but you can adjust them. For someone with a personality disorder, there is no adjustment. The pattern is rigid. The narcissist is narcissistic with their boss, their friends, their partner, and the pizza delivery person. The schizoid is distant everywhere. The pattern does not adapt to the situation. Second, chronicity. A personality disorder is not a bad week. It is a stable, long-lasting pattern that begins in adolescence or early adulthood and persists throughout life. It is chronic. And third, and most importantly, dysfunction. This is where a peculiarity becomes a disorder. The pattern must cause clinically significant distress or impairment in important areas of life: work, relationships, or sense of self. Your friend who is super organized and has an immaculate house doesn't have OCPD if they have a successful job and healthy relationships. But if that same need for order makes it impossible to finish projects at work, prevents them from forming relationships because no one is good enough, and causes constant anguish, then it crosses the line into a disorder. It's not about having traits, it's about the traits having you. A normal personality is a set of tools you use to live. A personality disorder is a cage you're trapped in. The stigma of mental health. It's easy to hear about these disorders and feel fear, disdain, or even repulsion. Movies and media have turned the psychopath into a monster and the histrionic into a caricature, but the reality is much more complex and much sadder. Behind the grandiosity of the narcissist, there is sometimes a fragility so profound that the self had to build a castle of arrogance to avoid crumbling. Behind the isolation of the schizoid, there can be an extreme sensitivity to the outside world that the only way to survive was to shut everything down. Behind the rigidity of the obsessive-compulsive, there is a terrifying fear of chaos and loss of control. Personality disorders are among the most stigmatized mental health conditions. Unlike depression or anxiety, where people tend to show more compassion, it's not their fault, it's their brain chemistry. Personality disorders are often conflated with one's very identity. People don't say he has narcissism. They say he is a narcissist. The disorder becomes a moral judgment. But no one chooses to have a personality disorder. They are the result of a complex interaction between genetics, biology, and very often, a deeply invalidating, abusive, or chaotic early environment. They are, in essence, survival strategies that developed in childhood to protect a vulnerable child, but which became rigid and counterproductive in adulthood. Understanding this does not mean excusing harmful behavior. Empathy is not absolution. People hurt by individuals with these disorders are entitled to their pain and to protect themselves. But understanding does allow us to move beyond stigma. It allows us to see the suffering that underlies dysfunctional behavior. Labeling is easy. Understanding is difficult. And in a world that is quick to judge, perhaps the most radical tool we have is not diagnosis, but empathy. The willingness to look beyond the disconcerting conduct and see the complex and often painful human story hidden beneath. And with that, we conclude another episode of Mind Matters. I hope this deep dive into personality disorders has offered you a new perspective and fostered a greater sense of understanding. Remember, knowledge is the first step towards compassion. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.